working between InDesign and Photoshop. So if we look at the Adobe suite, we have Adobe InDesign, Adobe Illustrator, and Adobe Photoshop. Those three as being the three main tools. InDesign is, of course, the layout application. Illustrator is the drawing application. And Photoshop is the photo manipulation application. So when we look at just Photoshop with InDesign, there are some really neat things we can do to bring our graphics into InDesign prepped to work with our text. So one of those, let's just look at what InDesign can do as far as removing a white background from a placed graphic. So I'm going to go ahead and do a file in place, and I'm going to locate a graphic. Let's find Blake, and I'm going to open it, and I'm going to click and drag so that I can size it to the size I'd like. Now, when we're dealing with this, I can play around with how InDesign determines where the edges of this will be. And that is found under the Clipping Path dialog box. So with it selected, I'm going to go to my Object menu, and I'm going to go down towards the bottom to Clipping Path. And I'm going to choose Options here. So this opens a Clipping Path dialog box, and I'll just slide it over to the side so you can still see what's happening here with the dog. Of course, turn Preview on. We always want to see what is happening. So we have two main things here. We have the threshold and we have the tolerance. At the top we can choose our type, and I'm going to choose to detect the edges. Now the alpha channel and the Photoshop path we will talk about in a minute. Let's do a detect edges and see what happened here is that InDesign detected or outlined where it thought the edge was. On the right side we have this blue gradient that it had a hard time finding. So this is where we need to adjust our threshold and tolerance. So the threshold, the top slider here, basically indicates the pixel values that will be made transparent. So if I were to go down here, 0, nothing. If I just get to 1, well, 2 was close enough. Let's go 1. Press tab, remember, not enter, because that will click OK. 1 means that only the white pixels will be transparent. If the threshold is set to 10, that indicates that the 10 lightest pixels out of a total of 256 values from light to dark will be transparent. Okay, so it affects all of the pixels in the graphic, and that's where the problem happens, because if it's in what we would call our foreground or background, if it's in part of our image, it will also become transparent. And look, as I increase this, you may see now some areas in the dog itself. We're losing part of the ear, part of the back of the head here, part of the body, because those are the lighter pixels. So it gets a little tricky trying to juggle it all. And you can see that in here I'm starting to go into the fur as well. And here I don't have enough because I'm getting the blue. So this is a bit of a tricky to try to get it right. The tolerance affects how smooth the edge of the image will be once those pixels are made transparent. So let's just go up a little bit more. I'm just going to go about one by one at a time because I don't want to get too far. That might work. So that my tolerance, it's 1 to 2 is acceptable. It's basically how many points here for the edges. Let's go ahead and click OK. Deselect, and it did a pretty good job. I've got a little bit of a blue halo over here on the ear, again a little bit down here, a little bit about the mouth, but it did a pretty decent job. So that's one way that I can remove a white background from a placed graphic. Let's move on and try another way. Oops, I moved to the inside. Let's make sure my frame is selected so we move the whole thing here. I'll just scroll down and we'll go for another option here dealing with alpha channels. So I'm going to actually go back to Photoshop, and I'm going to open a graphic here in Photoshop. Now Photoshop is where we can store selections. We've maybe saved selections in Photoshop previously. So when we save a selection, what actually is happening is that we are saving what's called an alpha channel. And alpha channels are just that. They're saved, created and saved selections in Photoshop. So sometimes we call these selections a silhouette. So if you hear that, it's basically is kind of a saved selection in Photoshop. So when we look in my channels panel here in Photoshop, you'll see that I have this is a CMYK, so I've got all of those color channels, but at the bottom I've got some other type of channels that have black and white, and those are my alpha channels. So where it's white is where it was selected, and where it's black is non-selected. Okay, so I can create these by just making a selection and choosing Save Selection, or making a selection and choosing the new alpha channel here. So those are two ways in Photoshop that I can do that. So now if we go back and into InDesign, and let's place this graphic, File and Place, and we're going to locate the same file I just had open. Okay, so now that we're here, I need to go to find my alpha channel. So what I'm going to do is, again, I can choose to do fitting if I want, but because I click and drag the loaded cursor, I have an appropriate size. So we're going to go back onto Object, and we're going to go back to this clipping path and Options. And this time under Type, I'm going to choose Alpha Channel. So when I click Alpha Channel, again, I do get a threshold and tolerance just like we looked at previously, so I can alter if I want. But it looks pretty darn good because it was the exact selection saved in Photoshop. It's going to be perfect. So I just need to click OK. And you can see here I have whole body. Let's click OK. So that's the saved selection. Looks really nice. I can also go back. Let's go back to the clipping path and Options. And there was a second called Head Only, and that was a second selection that was saved in Photoshop. So you can save multiple alpha channels and bring those in to InDesign. Okay, so an alpha channel deals with a selection that's raster. We have another method dealing with a clipping path, and this method is vector. If you think of vector, let's try this one more time. Let's slide over. We've got a little bit of room over there. File and Place. So now if I go back to Photoshop, which maybe we should do that first. And I can close this one. We're done. Let's open another document, and I'll show you what a clipping path is. So a clipping path, like I said, is vector, where an alpha channel is a raster. This one doesn't have any alpha, but if I go to paths, you'll see that I have some saved paths. Those are vectors. So they were created with some sort of a vector tool. Okay, so you can see those listed there in paths. Let's go back to InDesign and let's do a place and find that exact same picture. Here it is. Click Open. I'm just going to click and drag them right here. So now we're going to go under the Object menu again, and we're going to change this. Now this is one method. There's another method that I can do as well. So I'm going to go Clipping Path and Options, and this time I'm going to look at my Photoshop path, and here they are. There were 3 of them if you remember. So there's Blake and Rex, there's Blake alone, and there's Rex alone. So those are really nice. And again, both of these, you notice I do have the capability to go back and edit with my tools in InDesign to edit the amount. I'm going to cancel this actually and delete this, because there's another method that I can do as I'm placing this, and I've kind of skipped over this step. Let's do a place puppies again, but this time I'm going to show my import options here. So if I click that, what will happen is I'll get a second box that pops up as I'm importing my picture. And you can see that there's some options that I can do. And here, well, it's not going to show up for me. Sometimes you can see, oh, that was the alpha channel, that's why. My alpha channel, if I were to have an alpha channel, I could play around with that. I can choose these different options here to play around with if my file is coming in with something. So my bad, that was an alpha channel that we can do that with. Okay, so those are ways with the clipping path, the alpha channel. Think of alpha channel as raster, clipping path as vector, and then we also have InDesign's own method of detecting the edges. There's one more thing that you may want to do that actually InDesign doesn't recognize, and that's the gradients in an alpha channel. So I can do that in Photoshop. If I had an alpha channel here, which this document doesn't, but if I had one that did, I could do a selection that has a gradient, and so it sort of is a transparency effect. Now when I bring that into InDesign, it won't recognize that. So what I need to do is actually sort of cheat and play with the file before I bring it in. Let me show you. So I'm going to open up yet another document here. We're going to look for this one. So see how this one actually has an image on its own layer, and there's been a vignette or a faded edge applied to it. So the method here is that we need to make this selection with the feathered edge in Photoshop before we bring it to InDesign. The other important thing to remember is that this has to be on its own image layer. It can't be on a background layer. That will not work to bring in that transparency or that feathered edge. So I need to move, select my graphic with however means you do it with that feather, bring it to a new layer, make sure that original layer, the background layer, is turned off so that we can see that transparency through. And so then when we place this in InDesign, let's do a file in place. Let's find that dog layer right here, open. And it will remember that I see those options for the import. And if I click and drag, now you can see that I actually should have that transparency behind it. Let's just try this with a color and verify. And I'm going to bring it to the back, arrange, send it back, and there you go. So you can see that we have this transparency or a feathered edge that's happening. And so remember, the only way that will work is by doing that first in Photoshop and then bringing that into InDesign. So different ways that we can interact with our graphics coming from Photoshop.